The day my mother-in-law discovered what was really hidden in the car she sold. It began with a text message while I was still in my hospital bed, recovering from surgery. "I've done you a favor and sold that old Volvo of yours," it read. "You can thank me later." Little did she know that old Volvo contained something worth far more than the $3,000 she'd pocketed from the sale. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My heart monitor spiked as I read those words, causing a nurse to rush into my room. "Are you all right, Ms. Rivera?" she asked, concerned by my sudden distress. I couldn't even speak, just handed her my phone with trembling fingers. "Your mother-in-law sold your car?" she read, confusion crossing her face. "I don't understand why that would—" "It wasn't just a car," I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "And it wasn't hers to sell. My name is Elena Rivera, and for the past 3 years, I've been building a vintage jewelry restoration business out of my modest apartment in Portland. What started as a hobby during college gradually evolved into a respected small business with clients who appreciated my meticulous attention to detail and respect for historical craftsmanship. My specialty? Art Deco pieces from the 1920s and 30s, particularly those with unusual gemstone combinations or innovative mechanical elements. My late husband, Michael, had been my biggest supporter, encouraging me to turn my passion into a profession even when my confidence wavered. When he died 18 months ago in a climbing accident, I threw myself into my work, finding solace in the delicate repair of beautiful objects that had survived decades longer than their original owners. There was something comforting about giving new life to forgotten treasures. Michael's mother, Vivian Lockwood, had never approved of me. In her eyes, I was the bohemian art student who had distracted her son from the corporate law career she'd envisioned for him. The fact that Michael had chosen to become an environmental attorney instead of joining his father's prestigious firm was somehow my fault, despite the fact that he'd made this decision before we even met. After Michael's death, our relationship deteriorated from cool tolerance to barely concealed hostility. She blamed me for encouraging his reckless hobbies like rock climbing, conveniently forgetting that Michael had been climbing since his teens, long before I entered the picture. She criticized my decision to continue with my little jewelry hobby, rather than finding a proper career with benefits, dismissing the fact that my business was not only sustaining me financially, but providing the emotional anchor I desperately needed. The one thing Vivian and I shared was grief, but we processed it in vastly different ways. I sought healing through creation and preservation. She channeled her pain into control and criticism. And unfortunately for me, Michael's will had included a strange provision that gave his mother limited power as a co-executor of his estate, a legal complication that had created numerous headaches over the past year and a half. Which brings me back to the Volvo, my beloved 1989 Volvo 240 wagon. Michael and I had purchased it together 5 years ago, charmed by its boxy reliability and ample cargo space. The title was in both our names, and after his death, it transferred solely to me. At least, that's what should have happened. As I would later discover, Vivian had somehow convinced the DMV that as co-executor, she had authority over the vehicle as part of the estate settlement. A completely incorrect interpretation of her legal standing, but one that had obviously been persuasive enough to facilitate the unauthorized sale. "She can't just sell your property," my nurse, Tara, said firmly after I explained the situation. "That's illegal." "It is," I agreed, trying to stay calm despite the mounting panic I felt. But that's not even the worst part. What Vivian didn't know, what no one knew, was that the Volvo contained my most valuable restoration project to date. A rare Cartier mystery clock from 1928, one of only a dozen made that year. Unlike standard clocks, mystery clocks appear to have floating hands with no visible mechanism, creating the illusion that time is suspended in midair. This particular piece had been commissioned by a Hollywood silent film star and featured a carved rock crystal face surrounded by diamonds, emeralds, and black onyx in a quintessential Art Deco pattern. The clock had been brought to me by an elderly client whose grandfather had been the film star's personal assistant. Over the decades, the clock had suffered damage. Several stones were missing. The crystal face had developed a hairline crack, and the intricate mechanism had seized up completely. My client had offered me a substantial fee to restore it to its former glory, with a contract specifying that successful restoration would result in a generous bonus. I had been working on it for nearly 6 months, sourcing period-appropriate replacement stones, consulting with specialists in vintage clock mechanisms, and painstakingly repairing the delicate crystal. The restoration was nearly complete when I was suddenly hospitalized for an emergency appendectomy 3 days ago. In my haste to get to the hospital after days of ignoring increasingly severe abdominal pain, I'd left the clock securely wrapped in its custom case in the Volvo's hidden compartment beneath the cargo area floor, a special modification Michael had made for storing valuable equipment during our camping trips. The compartment was virtually undetectable unless you knew exactly where to press to release the hidden latch. The clock was worth approximately $300,000 in its unrestored condition. Fully restored, its market value would likely exceed $500,000. And now it was in the hands of a stranger who had purchased my car from my mother-in-law for a fraction of the worth of what lay hidden inside. "You need to call the police," Tara insisted, reaching for the phone by my bedside. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I shook my head, wincing as the movement pulled at my fresh surgical stitches. Not yet. I need to know who bought it first. I picked up my phone again and, steeling myself, called Vivian. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice crisp with artificial pleasantness. "Elena, how are you feeling? The nurses said you'd be released tomorrow." "You sold my car," I said, cutting straight to the point. "Yes," she replied, as if this were a perfectly reasonable action. "That old thing was falling apart, and you shouldn't be driving yourself around after surgery anyway. I'll help you find something more suitable when you're recovered. Something safer." I took a deep breath, fighting the urge to scream. "Vivian, that car was my property. You had no legal right to sell it." "Oh, don't be dramatic," she dismissed. "Michael would have wanted you to have something more reliable. Besides, as executor of his estate—" "Co-executor," I corrected, "and the car transferred to me after his death. It wasn't part of the estate settlement." A brief silence. "Well, what's done is done. The gentleman who bought it was quite pleased with the deal. He paid cash." My heart sank. Cash meant the transaction would be harder to trace. I need his contact information. Now. "I don't see why that's necessary," Vivian hedged. "He seemed very respectable. A collector of vintage European cars." I closed my eyes, counting silently to 10 before responding. "There was something very valuable inside the car, Vivian. Something that belongs to a client." "What are you talking about?" I checked the glove compartment and under the seats before he took it. There was nothing but some old maps and a flashlight. Of course she hadn't found the hidden compartment. Michael had designed it specifically to be invisible to casual inspection. "It was a clock," I said, deciding honesty was the fastest route to resolving this crisis. "An antique Cartier worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. I was restoring it for a client." Vivian's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Really, Elena? If you're trying to make me feel guilty about selling that rattletrap, you'll have to come up with something more believable. Who would entrust you with something so valuable?" The casual cruelty of her dismissal hit harder than I expected. Despite 18 months of similar jabs, her ability to wound me with her contempt hadn't diminished. Mrs. Ellington entrusted me with it because I'm one of the few restoration specialists on the West Coast qualified to work on mystery clocks, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. And now I need to get it back before she returns from Europe. Next week. There was a long pause before Vivian spoke again, her tone noticeably less certain. You're serious? Deadly serious. So I need the buyer's contact information right now, or my next call is to the police to report both the car and the clock as stolen property. Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear her calculating the potential social embarrassment if I involved the authorities. His name is Daniel Hargrove, she finally said. He left his card. I have it at home. I need that information immediately, I insisted. And Vivian, this conversation isn't over, not by a long shot. After hanging up, I lay back against my pillows, mind racing through possible scenarios. Best case, this Daniel Hargrove hadn't discovered the hidden compartment yet, and I could somehow convince him to return the clock, even if it meant buying back the entire car at a premium. Worst case, he'd found it, recognized its value, and had already contacted a dealer or auction house. My phone buzzed with a text from Vivian containing Daniel Hargrove's phone number and email address. I immediately attempted to call, but the call went straight to voicemail. I left what I hoped was a calm, reasonable message explaining that something important had accidentally been left in the vehicle and asking him to contact me as soon as possible. I then sent an email with the same information, attaching a photo of myself with the car to establish proof of ownership, being careful not to mention the value of the item in question. What now? Tara asked, having returned to check my vital signs. Now I wait, I said, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel, and I make a backup plan. While waiting for Hargrove to respond, I called my best friend and occasional business partner, Zoe Chen. Unlike me, Zoe had a family law, practice that occasionally intersected with property disputes. More importantly, she had a healthy skepticism of authority and a creative approach to problem solving. Your mother-in-law did what? She exclaimed after I explained the situation. That's straight up illegal. Unauthorized sale of a motor vehicle is a felony in Oregon. I know, but right now I'm more concerned about the clock than pressing charges, I admitted. Mrs. Ellington is returning from her European cruise next Thursday, expecting to see her family heirloom fully restored. If I don't have it by then, I'm not just looking at losing a valuable client, I could be liable for the full market value. Does your business insurance cover this kind of situation? Zoe asked. I laughed humorlessly. My policy covers damage or theft occurring on my premises or during designated transportation events. My mother-in-law illegally sold my car with a priceless antique inside it isn't exactly a standard coverage scenario. Fair point, she conceded. Have you heard back from this Hargrove guy? Nothing yet. I'm trying not to spiral into worst-case scenarios, but it's hard not to imagine him discovering the compartment, finding a Cartier clock, and immediately researching its value. Or he might not find it at all, Zoe pointed out. Those old Volvos are built like tanks. The hidden compartment could remain hidden for years if he doesn't know what to look for. I hadn't considered that possibility, and it offered a small flicker of hope. You're right. Michael designed it to be virtually undetectable. Here's what we're going to do, Zoe said, her voice taking on the decisive tone she used in court. First, I'm coming to pick you up tomorrow when you're discharged. Second, if you haven't heard from Hargrove by then, we'll draft a formal letter outlining the legal implications of keeping property that was unlawfully sold. Third, I'm going to have a very pointed conversation with Vivian about exceeding her authority as co-executor. I felt a rush of gratitude for her friendship. Thank you. I don't know what I'd do without you. Oh, and Elena? Document everything. Every text, every call, every email. If this goes south, we'll need a clear record of your attempts to resolve. it amicably before taking more serious action. After hanging up, I found myself staring at the ceiling of my hospital room, my mind toggling between hope and despair. The clock wasn't just valuable in monetary terms, it represented months of meticulous work, a testament to my skills as a restorer and the trust placed in me by a significant client. Losing it would be devastating professionally and personally. My phone buzzed again. I snatched it up, hoping to see Hargrove's name, but instead found another text from Vivian. Checked your apartment while you were in surgery to make sure everything was secure. Found receipt from jeweler for clock restoration. Is this really worth $450,000? Why would you keep something like that in a car? So irresponsible. A cold wave of anger washed over me. She had been in my apartment without permission, going through my personal papers. The invasion of privacy was breathtaking in its audacity. Before I could formulate a response that wouldn't consist entirely of expletives, my phone rang with an unknown number. "Hello?" I answered cautiously. "Is this Elena Rivera?" A deep voice inquired. "Yes, it is." "This is Daniel Hargrove. I received your messages about something left in the Volvo." My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it through the phone. "Yes, Mr. Hargrove. Thank you so much for calling back. There was something very important accidentally left in the car when it was sold. Without my knowledge or consent, I should add." "I gathered as much," he said. "The woman who sold it to me claimed to be the owner, but the registration in the glove compartment had 2 names on it. Yours was one of them." I felt a surge of hope. He sounded reasonable, perhaps even sympathetic. "Yes, the car belonged to my late husband and me. After his death, it transferred solely to me. His mother had no legal right to sell it." "I see," he said, his tone thoughtful. "That certainly complicates things from a legal standpoint. What exactly was left in the car? You weren't specific in your message." I hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. If he hadn't found the clock yet, mentioning its value might prompt him to search more thoroughly or, worse, to demand an exorbitant sum for its return. "It's a family heirloom," I said carefully. "A clock that I've been restoring for a client. It has significant sentimental value to them." "A clock," he repeated, and something in his voice made my stomach drop. Would this happen to be a Cartier mystery clock in a custom protective case? He'd found it. Somehow he'd discovered the hidden compartment and its precious contents. "Yes," I admitted, seeing no point in denial. "It's an extremely valuable antique that doesn't belong to me. I'm responsible for its safe return to my client next week." There was a pause, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "Ms. Rivera, I think we should meet in person to discuss this situation. I understand you're currently hospitalized?" "I'm being discharged tomorrow," I said, wary of his sudden interest in my whereabouts. "Perfect. I have a proposition that might resolve this predicament to everyone's satisfaction. Would you be available to meet at my office tomorrow afternoon? Say 3 o'clock. "Your office?" I asked, trying to buy time while I processed this unexpected turn. Yes, I should have introduced myself more thoroughly. "Daniel Hargrove, of Hargrove and Associates. We're an auction house specializing in rare timepieces and antique mechanical objects." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Of all the people in Portland who might have purchased my car, Vivian had somehow managed to sell it to someone who would instantly recognize the value of what lay hidden inside. The coincidence seemed too great to be random. "Did my mother-in-law mention what I do for a living when she sold you the car?" I asked, suspicion blooming. "She mentioned you were involved with jewelry somehow," he replied. Frankly, I was more interested in the car itself. Classic Volvos are something of a passion project for me, and finding an '89 wagon in that condition was quite exciting. He paused. The discovery of the clock was unexpected, to say the least. I wasn't entirely convinced by his casual tone, but I had few options at this point. 3 o'clock tomorrow works for me. Where is your office located? He gave me an address in the Pearl District, an upscale area known for its galleries and boutiques. I look forward to meeting you, Ms. Rivera. I think you'll find my proposition quite fair, given the circumstances. After hanging up, I immediately called Zoe back and relayed the conversation. This doesn't sound right, she said immediately. An auction house specializing in timepieces just happens to buy your car with a rare clock inside? And Vivian just happened to mention your profession? I'm getting serious setup vibes. You think she did this deliberately? I asked, though the pieces were already clicking into place in my mind. That she somehow knew about the clock. I think it's worth considering, Zoe replied. Has she shown unusual interest in your work recently? Asked about specific projects or clients? I thought back over the past few months. She did stop by the apartment unexpectedly about 2 weeks ago, claiming she was in the neighborhood. I was working on the clock at the time, and I remember being annoyed because I had to cover it before letting her in. She asked a lot of questions about what I was working on, but I kept it vague. And now she's been through your apartment while you were in surgery and found the receipt, Zoe added. I'd bet good money she was looking for documentation about the clock's value the first time she visited. The realization that Vivian might have orchestrated this entire situation, perhaps even timing it to coincide with my hospitalization, sent a chill through me. But why? What could she possibly gain from this? Control? Revenge? Financial leverage? Take your pick, Zoe said. You said yourself she's never approved of you. Maybe this is her way of forcing you into a vulnerable position. What should I do about the meeting with Hargrove tomorrow? We go together, she said firmly. I'll be representing you in any negotiations. If he's legitimate, he'll respect the presence of legal counsel. If he's working with Vivian in some capacity, my presence will make them both think twice about whatever they're planning. That night, despite the discomfort of my surgical incision and the hospital's standard noise level, I fell into an exhausted sleep. Dreams of floating clock hands and Vivian's triumphant smile chased me through the night, leaving me feeling unrested when morning finally came. Dr. Martinez arrived early to check my incision and approve my discharge. Everything looks good, she said, signing the necessary paperwork. Just remember, no heavy lifting for at least 4 weeks, and call immediately if you experience increased pain, fever, or any discharge from the incision site. I nodded, my mind already focused on the upcoming meeting with Hargrove. As promised, Zoe arrived to drive me home, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. How are you feeling? She asked as we left the hospital. Like someone cut out an organ, and then my mother-in-law sold my car with a fortune inside it, I replied dryly. She snorted. At least your sense of humor is intact. That's a good sign. Back at my apartment, I was relieved to find everything in its place, though the knowledge that Vivian had invaded my space while I was vulnerable left a sour taste. I changed into professional attire, wanting to project confidence and competence for the meeting with Hargrove. Ready for this? Zoe asked as we prepared to leave. I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders despite the pull of stitches. As ready as I'll ever be. Hargrove and Associates occupied the top floor of a renovated industrial building in the Pearl District. The reception area featured glass display cases containing an impressive array of antique watches, clocks, and mechanical curiosities. Under different circumstances, I would have been fascinated by the collection. A sleek, professional receptionist greeted us. Mr. Hargrove is expecting you, Ms. Rivera. And you are? She asked, looking at Zoe. Zoe Chen, Ms. Rivera's legal representative, she replied smoothly, handing over her business card. A flicker of surprise crossed the receptionist's face, but she recovered quickly. Of course. I'll let Mr. Hargrove know you're both here. Moments later, we were ushered into a spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River. Daniel Hargrove rose from behind an antique desk that probably cost more than my annual rent. He was tall, perhaps in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to negotiating high-value deals. "Ms. Rivera," he said, extending his hand. "A pleasure to meet you despite the unusual circumstances. And Ms. Chen, I wasn't expecting legal representation, but it's certainly prudent given the situation." We shook hands, and he gestured toward a seating area with comfortable leather chairs. "Please, make yourselves comfortable. Can I offer you anything? Water, coffee, tea?" We both declined, and once seated, Hargrove got straight to business. "I've brought the item in question," he said, nodding toward a safe in the corner of his office. "Before we discuss terms, however, I'd like to clarify a few points." "Of course," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the surge of relief at knowing the clock was here, presumably safe. "First, I want to assure you that I purchased the Volvo in good faith, believing Mrs. Lockwood had the legal authority to sell it. Had I known otherwise, I would never have proceeded with the transaction." Zoe nodded. "We appreciate that clarification, Mr. Hargrove. However, it doesn't change the fact that the sale was unauthorized and therefore invalid under Oregon law." "Agreed," he said, surprising us both. "Which is why I'm prepared to return the vehicle to Ms. Rivera immediately with documentation voiding the sale. I've already informed Mrs. Lockwood of this decision." I exchanged a quick glance with Zoe, who looked as taken aback as I felt by his ready capitulation. "That's very reasonable of you," I said cautiously. "Thank you. Now, regarding the clock," he continued, his expression turning more serious. "That presents a more complex situation. Here it comes, I thought. The demand for a finder's fee, or worse." "I recognized it immediately, of course," he said. "A 1928 Cartier mystery clock is unmistakable to someone in my profession. The Eleanor Davies Commission, if I'm not mistaken?" I nodded, impressed despite myself by his specific knowledge. Eleanor Davies had been the silent film star who commissioned the original piece. "The restoration work is exquisite," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. "Particularly the crystal face repair, almost undetectable, even under magnification. Your reputation is well-deserved, Ms. Rivera." "Thank you," I said, uncertain where this praise was leading. "Which brings me to my proposition." He leaned forward slightly. "I have a client who has been searching for a skilled restorer for a significant collection of Art Deco timepieces. Your work on the Davies clock is exactly the caliber he requires. I'd like to offer you a contract for the restoration of 12 pieces, with a substantial retainer and completion bonuses for each item." Of all the scenarios I had imagined, this wasn't even on the list. "You want to hire me?" "Precisely. My client is prepared to pay a premium for your expertise. The initial contract would be valued at approximately $275,000, with potential for ongoing work if the restorations meet expectations." I struggled to process this unexpected turn. "And the Davies clock?" "Will be returned to you immediately. Of course, it belongs to your client and the circumstances of its temporary displacement were unfortunate." Zoe, ever the cautious attorney, interjected. "This offer seems unusually generous, Mr. Hargrove. What's the catch?" He smiled, seemingly appreciative of her directness. "No catch, Ms. Chen. My business relies on relationships with the finest craftspeople in various specialties. Ms. Rivera's work is exceptional, and my client has been searching for someone with her specific skills for over a year. This situation, while unorthodox, presented an opportunity to see her work firsthand." He paused. "I should mention that my client is not connected to Mrs. Lockwood in any way, if that's your concern." "It had crossed our minds," Zoe admitted. Hargrove nodded. "Understandable given the circumstances. Rest assured, this is strictly a professional proposition based on the quality of Ms. Rivera's craftsmanship. May I ask who your client is? I inquired. I'm afraid they prefer to remain anonymous at this stage, he replied. Many collectors value their privacy, as I'm sure you're aware. However, should you accept the contract, a formal introduction would be arranged. I glanced at Zoe, who gave a slight nod, indicating I should continue. I'd need to see the contract details before making any decisions, I said. Of course. Hargrove opened a folder on the coffee table between us and slid across a document. The full terms are outlined here. You're welcome to review it with Ms. Chen and make any necessary amendments. As Zoe began scanning the document, Hargrove rose and walked to the safe. After entering a combination, he removed a familiar custom case and brought it to the seating area. I believe this belongs in your care, he said, placing it gently on the table. With slightly trembling hands, I opened the case to reveal the Cartier clock, its rock crystal face catching the afternoon light, the meticulously restored mechanism causing the hands to appear as if floating in midair. Relief washed over me at seeing it intact and undamaged. Thank you, I said, unable to keep the emotion from my voice as I secured the case again. Zoe looked up from the contract. This appears legitimate, she said, surprise evident in her tone. The terms are actually quite favorable. Hargrove smiled. I believe in fair compensation for exceptional work. The timeline allows for your recovery, Ms. Rivera, and includes provisions for adjustments should any of the pieces require more extensive restoration than initially assessed. Still somewhat stunned by this unexpected resolution, I found myself nodding. I'd like to take the contract home to review thoroughly, if that's acceptable. Of course. Take whatever time you need. He reached into his desk and retrieved a set of keys. The Volvo is in our secure garage. My assistant can bring it around whenever you're ready to leave. As we prepared to depart, clock and contract in hand, a thought occurred to me. Mr. Hargrove, may I ask how you discovered the hidden compartment? It was specifically designed to be undetectable. He smiled. That. Pure chance, I'm afraid. I was examining the cargo area, planning to replace the carpet, and noticed a slight difference in the resonance when tapping along the floor. My curiosity got the better of me. It was a plausible explanation, though something about it still struck me as convenient. Nevertheless, with the clock safely returned and an unexpected professional opportunity in hand, I wasn't inclined to press further. As we left the building, the Volvo already waiting at the curb, Zoe voiced what I was thinking. That was not at all what I expected. Me neither, I admitted, carefully placing the clock in its familiar hiding spot before closing the compartment. Do you think it's legitimate? The contract is solid, she confirmed, and returning both the car and the clock without resistance suggests good faith. Still, I'd recommend having your insurance agent review the terms before you sign anything. I nodded, then checked my phone to find 3 missed calls from Vivian. She's not going to be happy about this. Good, Zoe said firmly. She broke the law and nearly cost you a valuable client and potentially your professional reputation. She deserves to squirm a little. A lot, I corrected, starting the engine. She deserves to squirm a lot. Back at my apartment, I carefully placed the clock on my workbench, examining it once more to ensure it hadn't suffered any damage during its unexpected journey. Satisfied that everything was in order, I turned my attention to the contract. From Hargrove. The terms were indeed generous, almost suspiciously so. A 6-figure retainer for restoration work was virtually unheard of in my field, especially for someone with my relatively modest professional profile. Something still doesn't add up, I murmured to myself, flipping through the pages again. The contract was impeccably drafted, offering protections for both parties and clearly outlining expectations, timelines, and compensation. By all appearances, it was a dream opportunity. My phone buzzed insistently. Vivian's name flashing on the screen for the fourth time. Steeling myself, I finally answered. Elena. She began without preamble, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. I've just had a most unpleasant conversation with Mr. Hargrove. He tells me the sale of the Volvo has been voided. Would you care to explain? I'd be happy to, I replied, newfound confidence straightening my spine despite the pull of surgical stitches. You sold property that didn't belong to you. That's illegal, Vivian. The technical term is conversion, the unauthorized assumption and exercise of ownership rights over someone else's property. It's a civil offense at minimum, potentially criminal depending on intent. The legal terminology, gleaned from conversations with Zoe, had the desired effect. Vivian's momentary silence spoke volumes. I was acting in your best interest, she finally said, her tone shifting to the martyred righteousness she often employed. That car was a death trap. Michael would have wanted— Don't! I cut her off sharply. Don't presume to tell me what Michael would have wanted. He loved that car. We chose it together. And more importantly, it's my property, not yours. Well, she huffed, clearly thrown by my directness. There's no need to be dramatic about it. The sale has been reversed. So no harm done. The casual dismissal of her actions ignited something in me. A slow, burning fury that had been building for 18 months of subtle undermining, backhanded comments, and outright interference. No harm done, I echoed incredulously. You entered my apartment without permission while I was in surgery. You went through my personal papers. You sold my car without authorization. And you nearly cost me a valuable client relationship and potentially my professional reputation by separating me from a priceless artifact I was contractually obligated to protect. That ridiculous clock, she scoffed, though with less conviction than before. How was I supposed to know you'd leave something so valuable in a car? It's irresponsible. It was in a hidden compartment specifically designed for secure storage, I countered. And regardless, that's not the point. The point is you had no right to sell the car, enter my apartment, or access my business documents. Your position as co-executor doesn't give you authority over my personal property or business affairs. Another silence, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice had taken on a calculating quality that sent a chill down my spine. I understand Mr. Hargrove has offered you a rather lucrative contract, she said. How fortunate for you. Almost too fortunate, one might say. The implication was clear. She suspected a connection between me and Hargrove, perhaps even suggesting I had orchestrated the entire situation for financial gain. Whatever you're insinuating, Vivian, you might want to reconsider, I said evenly. I have documentation of every communication regarding this situation, including your admission via text that you entered my apartment without permission and accessed confidential client information. Are you threatening me? She asked, genuine, surprise in her voice. I'm setting boundaries, I corrected. Something I should have done a long time ago. Your behavior has crossed several legal and ethical lines, and while I have no desire to pursue legal action against my late husband's mother, I will if necessary. The silence that followed was so prolonged, I wondered if she had hung up. I see, she finally said, her voice unnaturally controlled. Well, I suppose we'll need to discuss the parameters of our relationship going forward, perhaps over dinner tomorrow evening. My house, 7 o'clock. The invitation, more of a command, really took me by surprise. Vivian's tactical retreats were typically followed by regrouping and approaching from a different angle, not by social invitations. I'm still recovering from surgery, I reminded her, buying time to consider my response. Nothing elaborate, she assured me, her tone suddenly solicitous. Just a simple meal. We have matters to discuss regarding Michael's estate that can't be postponed much longer. The mention of estate matters piqued my interest. Though most of Michael's affairs had been settled, there were still a few outstanding issues. Primarily, related to a family trust that had complex distribution requirements. All right, I agreed cautiously. 7 o'clock tomorrow. After hanging up, I immediately called Zoe to update her on both conversations, with Hargrove and with Vivian. The dinner invitation is suspicious, she said immediately. Classic power. Move. Getting you on her territory. And mentioning estate matters is likely a strategy to ensure you'll come. That was my read as well, I admitted. But I'm curious what she's planning. She sounded different. Not exactly contrite, but definitely recalibrating. Just be careful, Zoe warned, and let me know how it goes. Meanwhile, I've checked out Hargrove more thoroughly. His auction house is legitimate. Been in business for over 20 years, solid reputation, specializes in exactly what he claimed. No obvious connections to Vivian or the Lockwood family that I could find. This was reassuring, though it still left the question of how Vivian had managed to sell my car to precisely the kind of buyer who would recognize and appreciate the hidden treasure within. One more thing, Zoe added. I looked into the ownership. History of that Cartier clock. The provenance checks out. It was indeed commissioned by Eleanor Davies in 1928, passed to her personal assistant upon her death, and has remained in that family until recently. No red flags there. Thanks for checking, I said, grateful once again for her thoroughness. The following day, I focused on finalizing the restoration of the Davies clock. With careful precision, I adjusted the intricate mechanism, ensuring that the hands moved with the ethereal floating quality that made mystery clocks so captivating. By late afternoon, the piece was complete, ready to be returned to Mrs. Ellington upon her arrival back in Portland. At 6:30, I carefully dressed for dinner with Vivian, choosing a professional outfit that conveyed confidence without being overtly confrontational. The navy blue sheath dress and structured blazer were armor of a sort, helping me feel prepared for whatever manipulations or machinations awaited me. Vivian's house, a gracious colonial in Portland Heights, was exactly as I remembered it, impeccably maintained, tastefully decorated, and coldly unwelcoming. Every surface gleamed with polish, every object precisely placed. It was a museum to perfect appearances, much like Vivian herself. She greeted me at the door with her social smile firmly in place. Elena, how lovely to see you. You're looking well for someone recently out of surgery. Thank you for your concern, I replied neutrally, following her into the formal dining room where the table was set for two with the Lockwood family china and silver. Just us this evening, she said, noting my glance around the room. I thought it best we speak privately. Dinner proceeded with superficial pleasantries, Vivian inquiring after my recovery, commenting on the weather, sharing anecdotes about mutual acquaintances. It wasn't until dessert was served that she finally addressed the elephant in the room. I've been reflecting on our situation, she began, setting down her coffee cup with precision. Perhaps I've been overzealous in my role as co-executor. The admission, tepid as it was, nearly caused me to choke on my tea. In 18 months, I had never heard Vivian acknowledge overstepping. That's one way to put it, I agreed cautiously. Michael's death was. She paused, something genuine flickering across her carefully maintained facade. It shattered certain expectations I had about the future, about legacy. I nodded, understanding this all too well. Michael's death had devastated us both, albeit in different ways. The trust, she continued, redirecting to business. As you know, Michael's grandfather established a substantial family trust that includes property, investments, and various assets. Michael's portion transfers in part to you as his widow, and in part to future heirs. This wasn't new information. The complicated trust had been a topic of numerous discussions with estate attorneys. Since there are no children, Vivian continued, a familiar note of disappointment entering her voice. The heir portion remains in trust until certain conditions are met. I'm aware of the terms, I said, wondering where she was going with this recitation of facts we both knew. Vivian reached for a folder beside her plate and slid it across the table. What you may not be aware of is this codicil, added by Michael's grandfather in the final amendment to the trust. Curious despite? Myself, I opened the folder and scanned the legal document inside. The language was dense, but one passage had been highlighted. In the event that a beneficiary's spouse continues or establishes a family business of significant cultural or artistic merit, said spouse may petition the trustees for recognition as a legacy enterprise, thereby qualifying for distributions otherwise reserved for direct heirs. I looked up, genuinely confused. I don't understand. What does this mean? It means, Vivian said slowly, that your jewelry restoration business could potentially qualify for trust distributions of approximately $30,000 annually, in perpetuity, if recognized as a legacy enterprise. The amount wasn't life-changing, but it was significant. Enough to cover my studio rent and insurance costs, freeing up other income for business expansion or personal security. Why are you showing me this now? I asked, suspicion immediately flaring. The trust has been in probate for over a year. Vivian's fingers drummed once on the table, the only outward sign of discomfort. This particular codicil was overlooked initially. It came to light during a recent review of the documentation. Overlooked, I repeated skeptically. By you and the team of estate attorneys who've been managing the probate process? She met my gaze directly. Yes. The single word hung between us, both admission and challenge. We both knew it was highly unlikely that such a provision had been genuinely missed by experienced probate attorneys. Far more probable was that Vivian had deliberately concealed it, hoping I would eventually give up my little hobby business and move away, relinquishing any claim to ongoing Lockwood family resources. Why tell me now? I pressed. What's changed? She took a measured sip of her coffee before responding. Your recent interaction with Hargrove has demonstrated that your work has greater significance than I had previously recognized. The Davies clock restoration alone represents a level of artistic merit that would qualify under the trust provisions. Translation: my business was suddenly legitimate in her eyes because someone with money and social standing had validated. I see, I said, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from my voice. And the timing of this revelation has nothing to do with my threat of legal action regarding the car and apartment invasion? A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, or grudging respect, crossed her face. Let's be practical, Elena. We've had our differences, but we're still family by law. This provision represents a mutually beneficial arrangement. You receive financial support for your business. The Lockwood name remains connected to a legacy enterprise of cultural significance. The calculation was so transparent, it was almost admirable. Vivian was offering a financial carrot instead of her usual stick, hoping to neutralize my anger and potential legal action while simultaneously maintaining some level of control through the trust's oversight provisions. What's the catch? I asked directly. There must be conditions attached to this recognition. She smiled thinly. Perceptive as always. Yes, there are conditions. The business must maintain certain quality standards, verified annually. It must continue to operate within the Pacific Northwest. And, she hesitated slightly, it must incorporate the Lockwood name in some fashion. There it was. The true price. Branding my independent business with the Lockwood name, effectively placing it under the family umbrella. It was a shrewd move, offering financial security while ensuring I remained tethered to Vivian and her influence. I'll need to review the full terms with my attorney, I said, neither accepting nor rejecting the proposition outright. Of course, she agreed smoothly. Take whatever time you need. The next trust committee meeting isn't for 6 weeks. As I drove home later that evening, My mind churned with conflicting thoughts. The trust provision could provide valuable stability for my business, but at what cost to my independence? Vivian's sudden recognition of my work's value was transparently self-serving, yet the financial support was real enough. I called Zoe the moment I got home, relaying the unexpected development. "She's trying to buy you off," Zoe said immediately. "Classic damage control strategy. She knows she overstepped legally and is worried about potential repercussions, both legal and social." "Agreed," I said. "But does that make the opportunity itself any less valid? $30,000 a year would make a significant difference for my business." "True," Zoe acknowledged. "But consider the strings attached. Annual review by the trust committee, which undoubtedly includes Vivian or her allies. Geographic restrictions limiting your potential expansion. And the Lockwood name requirement." She trailed off meaningfully. "That's the real sticking point," I admitted. "Branding my independent business with the family name feels like surrendering something essential." "Exactly. It's not just about the money. It's about control and narrative. Vivian wants to reframe your success as a Lockwood enterprise rather than your own independent achievement." The insight resonated deeply. From the beginning, Vivian had attempted to minimize my identity separate from Michael, treating me as an accessory to her son rather than an individual with my own talents and ambitions. This latest move, while financially beneficial, continued that pattern under the guise of reconciliation. "There's something else bothering me," I said, switching topics slightly. "The timing of everything. Vivian selling my car specifically to Hargrove, who happens to specialize in exactly the type of antiques I restore. Hargrove mysteriously discovering the hidden compartment. And now this sudden revelation about trust provisions benefiting my business." "You think it's all connected?" Zoe asked, skepticism evident in her voice. "I don't know," I admitted. "It could be coincidence, but it feels orchestrated somehow, like I'm being maneuvered toward a specific outcome." "What outcome?" "That's what I can't figure out," I said, frustration evident in my voice. "On the surface, everything seems to be working in my favor. I got the car back, the clock is safe, I have a lucrative contract offer, and now potential trust income. But why would Vivian facilitate any of that, even inadvertently? What does she gain?" "Control," Zoe suggested. "Legitimacy for interfering in your life. The ability to claim credit for your success by attaching the Lockwood name to it." It made sense, yet something still felt off. A missing piece in the puzzle that I couldn't quite identify. "What are you going to do about the trust provision?" Zoe asked, bringing me back to the immediate question. I sighed, massaging my temples against an incipient headache. "I need to see the full documentation, including any conditions and oversight provisions. If the strings attached are reasonable, it would be financially irresponsible to reject it outright. But I won't make any decisions until I understand exactly what I'm agreeing to." "Smart," she approved. "And Hargrove's contract?" "Same approach. I'll have my insurance agent review it tomorrow, along with a contract attorney for any hidden pitfalls. If it's legitimate, it represents a significant opportunity for business growth." After hanging up, I found myself drawn to my workbench where the Davies clock sat in its protective case, ready for return to its owner. The floating hands marked the passage of time with silent elegance, the restored mechanism functioning as perfectly as it had nearly a century ago when first created. There was something meditative about restoration work, the careful preservation of history, the revival of craftsmanship from another era. In many ways, it was the opposite of Vivian's approach to life, where she sought to control and direct. Restoration required patience and respect for original intent. Where she imposed her will, restoration demanded humility and sensitivity to the creator's vision. Perhaps that fundamental difference in worldview explained our persistent conflict. Vivian saw my independence as defiance. I saw her control as suffocation. She measured value by social status and financial metrics. I found meaning in preserving beauty and craftsmanship. Michael had somehow bridged that gap, loving both his mother's ambition and my more introspective approach to life. Without his mediating presence, we had fallen into increasingly adversarial positions, neither willing to concede ground to the other's perspective. The next morning, I contacted Mrs. Ellington to arrange the return of her clock. Her delight at the restoration was evident even over the phone. "My dear, I can't wait to see it," she enthused. "I'll come directly from the airport tomorrow afternoon, if that's convenient for you." "Perfectly convenient," I assured her. "Everything is ready for your inspection." With that appointment scheduled, I turned my attention to Hargrove's contract, forwarding it to both my insurance agent and the contract attorney Zoe had recommended. By midday, I had received preliminary responses from both. The contract appeared solid, with standard protections and reasonable terms. The insurance agent noted that the liability coverage requirements were actually more favorable than industry standard, suggesting Hargrove had confidence in my work and wasn't looking to create opportunities for penalty claims. Still feeling unsettled about the interconnected nature of recent events, I decided to do some investigating of my own. Starting with public records, I researched Hargrove and Associates more thoroughly, looking for any connection to the Lockwood family or their various business interests. On the surface, there was nothing. No shared board memberships, no joint ventures, no obvious social connections. But when I expanded my search to include historical records, an interesting detail emerged. Hargrove's auction house had handled the estate sale for Michael's great-aunt Cordelia some 15 years ago, managing the disposition of a substantial collection of antiques and art objects. It wasn't a smoking gun by any means, but it established a prior business relationship between Hargrove and the extended Lockwood family. That connection might explain how Vivian knew to approach him specifically with the car, though it still didn't clarify why she would direct a valuable antique clock into the hands of someone qualified to recognize its worth. Unless she hadn't known about the clock when she initially sold the car. Perhaps she had chosen Hargrove because of the prior family connection, not realizing he would discover the hidden compartment and its valuable contents. That would explain her genuine shock when I mentioned the clock's value, followed by her hasty apartment search to verify my claim. But if that were the case, what explained Hargrove's subsequent contract offer? Was it truly based on the merit of my restoration work, or was there another motivation? My phone rang, interrupting this line of thought. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. "Elena Rivera," I answered professionally. "Ms. Rivera, this is Daniel Hargrove. I wanted to follow up regarding the contract proposal. Have you had a chance to review it?" "I have," I confirmed. "My legal and insurance advisors are conducting their final review, but preliminary feedback is positive." "Excellent," he said, sounding genuinely pleased. "I believe this arrangement will be beneficial for all parties involved. My client is particularly eager to see your work on a piece with significant mechanical complications. A Breguet carriage clock with a repeating function that has proven challenging for previous restorers. The mention of such a specific piece, and a notoriously difficult one at that, lent credibility to the legitimacy of the contract. This wasn't just a vague promise of work. There were actual, challenging projects awaiting attention. That sounds fascinating, I said truthfully. Repeating mechanisms from that era can be particularly temperamental. Precisely why your expertise is so valued, he replied. Few restorers have your patience with intricate mechanical elements. He paused briefly. There is one additional matter I wanted to discuss. It's come to my attention that the Lockwood Family Trust has provisions supporting legacy enterprises in artistic fields. The comment froze me momentarily. How would Hargrove know about trust provisions that had supposedly only just been discovered by Vivian? That's recently been brought to my attention as well, I said carefully. May I ask how you're familiar with the details of the Lockwood Family Trust? A slight pause. My firm has handled several estate matters for extended members of the Lockwood family over the years. In the antiques world, family trusts with provisions for artistic enterprises are of particular interest, as they often involve our services. His tone remained casual, professional. I merely mentioned it as it might provide additional financial stability as you consider expanding your restoration work through our contract. It was a reasonable explanation, yet it deepened my suspicion that these supposedly separate developments were in fact connected by invisible threads. Hargrove, knowing about trust provisions that Vivian had only revealed to me the previous evening, stretched coincidence to breaking point. I appreciate the information, I said neutrally. I'm still reviewing the full trust documentation with my attorney. Of course, he agreed smoothly. These matters require careful consideration. I look forward to your decision on the contract when you're ready. After hanging up, I immediately called Zoe again, updating her on this latest development. Definitely fishy, she agreed. The timing is too convenient. Either Vivian informed Hargrove about revealing the trust provision to you, or he already knew about it and is somehow coordinating with her. But to what end? I pressed, returning to my persistent question. What does either of them gain from this elaborate setup? I don't know yet, Zoe admitted, but I think it's time we find out. Let me do some deeper digging into both the trust provisions and Hargrove's previous dealings with the Lockwood family. There has to be a connection we're missing. As I hung up, a text message arrived from Vivian. Have you had a chance to consider the trust opportunity? The family attorney is available to answer any questions you might have. The prompt follow-up increased my suspicion that Vivian and Hargrove were somehow coordinating their approaches. Deciding to test this theory, I crafted a careful response. Still reviewing the documentation. I've also been discussing the Hargrove contract with my advisors. Interesting coincidence that both opportunities arose simultaneously. Her response came quickly. No coincidence in recognizing quality work. Both the trust and Hargrove value artistic merit. Good restoration work is rare in today's market. The deflection was smooth but telling. She hadn't expressed surprise at my mentioning Hargrove in connection with the trust, suggesting she was indeed aware of his knowledge about the trust provisions. Something larger was at play here. A coordinated effort to guide me toward specific decisions regarding my business and its connection to the Lockwood family legacy. The question remained, why now? And what did Vivian truly hope to gain? The following afternoon, Mrs. Ellington arrived at my studio directly from the airport, her elegant appearance belying the fatigue of international travel. At 78, she carried herself with the poise of someone who had navigated high society for decades, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her clothing understated yet unmistakably expensive. "Elena, my dear," she greeted me warmly, clasping my hands in hers. "How are you recovering? I was so distressed to hear about your emergency surgery." "Much better, thank you," I assured her, touched by her genuine concern. Unlike many wealthy clients who viewed artisans as merely service providers, Mrs. Ellington had always treated me with respect and personal warmth. "And the clock?" she asked, her eyes brightening with anticipation. "Were you able to complete the restoration despite your health challenges?" "See for yourself," I invited, gesturing toward my workbench where the mystery clock awaited under a protective cloth. With a showman's sense of timing, I removed the cover to reveal the Cartier masterpiece in all its restored glory. The afternoon, sunlight streaming through my studio windows caught the facets of the carved rock crystal, sending prismatic reflections dancing across the walls. The clock's hands appeared to float magically within the transparent face, the hidden mechanism, once again working flawlessly after nearly a century. Mrs. Ellington's breath caught audibly. "Oh, Elena," she whispered, moving closer to examine the details. "It's magnificent. just as my grandfather described it when he spoke of Miss Davy's treasures. She circled the workbench slowly, studying the clock from every angle, occasionally reaching out to touch a specific detail with reverent fingers. "The emeralds," she murmured, indicating the small green stones that marked the hours. "You found perfect matches for the missing ones." "It took some searching," I admitted. "I wanted period-appropriate stones with the same Colombian origin as the originals. The color saturation and clarity had to be consistent." She nodded appreciatively, understanding the challenge. "And the crack in the crystal face? I can't even see where it was." "That was the most technically demanding aspect," I explained, indicating the nearly invisible repair. "The original rock crystal had to be stabilized from within using a specially formulated adhesive that matches the refractive index exactly. Any deviation would have created a visible line when light passes through." For several minutes, Mrs. Ellington continued her examination, asking detailed questions about various aspects of the restoration. Finally, she straightened, wiping away a tear that had formed in the corner of her eye. "My grandfather would be overjoyed to see it restored to its original beauty," she said softly. "He always spoke of this clock as the pinnacle of art and technology united. To him, it represented everything magical about the era. Innovation disguised as mystery, technology serving beauty." Her words resonated deeply with me. The best restoration work wasn't just about repairing physical objects, it was about preserving the human stories they contained, the values and aspirations they represented. "I have something for you," Mrs. Ellington continued, reaching into her handbag. She withdrew an envelope and handed it to me. "Your final payment, with the completion bonus as agreed, and something extra." I opened the envelope to find not only the expected check, but a second document, a letter of recommendation written on Mrs. Ellington's personal stationery, addressed "to whom it may concern," and extolling my skills in the most glowing terms. "This is very generous," I said, genuinely moved by the gesture. "You've earned it," she replied firmly. "In fact, I've taken the liberty of mentioning your work to several friends in my collector's circle. You may be receiving some inquiries in the coming weeks." This unexpected endorsement from a respected figure in the collecting community could significantly impact my business's trajectory, potentially bringing in the kind of high-profile clients who might otherwise never discover my small studio. "Thank you," I said simply, knowing she would understand the depth of gratitude behind those inadequate words. As Mrs. Ellington prepared to leave with her restored treasure carefully packed for transport, she paused at the door. "You know, Elena, my grandfather often said that true craftsmanship is the great equalizer. In his view, the ability to create or restore beauty transcended social boundaries. The hands that could bring an object like this back to life," she gestured to the clock's case, "deserved the same respect as those who could afford to commission it in the first place." With those parting words she left, leaving me to reflect on their significance. In my ongoing conflict with Vivian, this was the core issue. Recognition of the value in what I created, not just as a commercial service, but as a meaningful contribution to cultural preservation. That evening, Zoe called with updates from her investigation. "I've found something interesting," she began without preamble. "The Lockwood Family Trust isn't just about money, it's about artifacts." "What kind of artifacts?" I asked, immediately intrigued. "Art objects, primarily. Apparently, Michael's great-grandfather was quite the collector during the 1920s and 30s. The trust includes provisions not just for financial assets, but for maintaining and preserving a significant collection of Art Deco pieces, including several timepieces." The connection clicked into place with sudden clarity. "And let me guess, Hargrove has been involved in appraising or managing these pieces?" "Bingo," Zoe confirmed. "His firm has been the exclusive auction partner for any Lockwood pieces released from the collection over the past 20 years. But here's the kicker. According to the trust provisions, certain legacy items cannot be sold or removed from the collection without unanimous agreement from all trustees, including any qualifying spouses of beneficiaries. The implications hit me like a physical wave. So, as Michael's widow, if my business qualifies under the trust provisions, you would have veto power over the disposition of any legacy items in the collection, Zoe finished. Which explains why Vivian suddenly cares about recognizing your business as a legitimate artistic enterprise. The pieces were finally falling into place. Vivian wasn't offering financial support out of sudden respect for my work. She was attempting to bring me under the trust's umbrella to secure my cooperation for something related to the Lockwood collection. There's more, Zoe continued. The trust requires a complete reappraisal of all assets every 20 years. Guess when the next mandatory appraisal is due? Let me guess. Soon? Next month, she confirmed. And guess who's been contracted to conduct the appraisal? Hargrove, I said, the final connection becoming clear. Exactly. So here's what I think is happening. Vivian needs your cooperation for something related to the upcoming appraisal. My guess? There are items she wants to sell or otherwise remove from the collection, but she needs your approval as a qualified trust beneficiary. And Hargrove's lucrative contract offer? It could be legitimate in terms of the work itself, but it's almost certainly intended to influence your decision-making regarding the trust collection. He has a vested interest in maintaining his relationship with the Lockwood family as their exclusive auction partner. The revelation explained so much. Vivian's sudden about-face regarding my business, Hargrove's generous contract, the coincidental timing of these opportunities. What remained unclear was exactly what items Vivian wanted to remove from the collection and why. I need to see the full inventory of the trust collection, I said decisively. As a potential beneficiary, I should have that right. Already requested it, Zoe confirmed. Should have the documentation tomorrow. In the meantime, I'd suggest maintaining the appearance of considering both offers without committing to either. Let's see what else we can uncover before you make any decisions. The next morning, I received an unexpected text from Vivian. Need to discuss trust matters urgently. Can you meet for lunch? Fleming's at noon. Her choice of venue, an upscale restaurant in the financial district, suggested she wanted a public setting for our conversation, perhaps to discourage any heated exchanges. It also indicated the matter was significant enough to warrant immediate attention rather than waiting for a more formal meeting. I'll be there, I responded, simply. Fleming's was busy with the usual lunchtime crowd of financial professionals and business executives when I arrived. Vivian had secured a corner table that offered relative privacy, while remaining in full view of the restaurant's other patrons, a calculated choice that would keep our conversation civil while allowing her to be seen dining with her late son's widow, maintaining appropriate family appearances. Elena, she greeted me with a nod as I took my seat. Thank you for coming on short notice. Your text suggested urgency, I replied neutrally. What's so important that it couldn't wait? Vivian signaled to the waiter for her usual martini before responding. I've been informed that you're conducting inquiries into the Lockwood collection inventory. The speed with which this information had reached her was telling. She clearly had sources within the trust administration, keeping her apprised of any activity related to the collection. As a potential trust beneficiary, I have a right to that information, I pointed out calmly. Of course, she agreed, surprisingly readily. I'm not questioning your right to the information. I'm merely suggesting that we could approach this more collaboratively. The waiter returned with her martini and took our lunch orders. Once he had departed, Vivian leaned forward slightly. Let's be direct with each other, she proposed. You're aware by now that the trust collection includes significant Art Deco timepieces and other objects that align with your professional expertise. You're also likely aware that Hargrove has a long-standing relationship with the family regarding these items. I nodded, seeing no reason to deny knowledge she clearly knew I possessed. What you may not know, she continued, is the current state of some of these pieces. Several of the most valuable items have deteriorated significantly over the decades. Others have been maintained but require expert restoration to realize their full value. This was new information, and despite my wariness, my professional interest was piqued. What kind of deterioration are we talking about? Environmental damage primarily, she explained. The collection was stored improperly during the 1970s, before proper conservation protocols were established. Several of the timepieces have significant oxidation issues with their mechanical components. Others have degraded decorative elements, ivory inlays that have yellowed, enamel work that has cracked, that sort of thing. Her knowledge of specific conservation issues suggested she had taken a more active interest in the collection than I would have expected. Vivian had never struck me as someone particularly invested in artistic or historical preservation. And, "You're telling me this because," I prompted, though I could already guess her direction. "Because I'm proposing a mutually beneficial arrangement," she replied, taking a sip of her martini. "The trust needs expert restoration work on these pieces before the reappraisal next month. You need established credentials to expand your business, beyond individual clients like Mrs. Ellington." "I've received the documentation," I told her when she answered. "Very comprehensive. I'm particularly interested in the items listed with location unverified. Will those be available for inspection as well?" A brief pause followed, just long enough to confirm my suspicions that this was a sensitive point. "Those notations are administrative oversights," she replied smoothly. "The pieces in question were temporarily relocated during renovations to the storage facilities in 2018. They've since been returned to the main collection, but haven't yet been formally documented in their new locations." The explanation sounded plausible on the surface, but something in her tone suggested rehearsal rather than spontaneity. "I see," I said neutrally. "And when might I be able to examine the physical collection, including these pieces?" "I've arranged for access next Wednesday," she informed me. "The Trust storage facility requires security clearance for visitors, which takes a few days to process." This was reasonable for a collection of such value, yet it also conveniently delayed my ability to verify the presence of the questionable items. "That works with my schedule," I agreed. "And regarding item 37, the Patek Philippe you mentioned, in your note, is there a particular reason you've highlighted it as a priority?" Another slight hesitation. "As I mentioned, it has special family significance. Michael was particularly fond of it. I thought you might appreciate working on a piece that held meaning for him." The invocation of Michael's name was becoming a pattern, a strategic appeal to emotional connection whenever direct questions arose. It was effective, but increasingly transparent as a manipulation tactic. "I don't recall Michael ever mentioning this watch," I said carefully, testing the claim. "He spoke often about his grandfather's camera collection, but never about timepieces." "Perhaps not to you," Vivian replied, a hint of her old condescension returning. "Some family matters were private." The implication that Michael had kept certain family traditions from me was clearly intended to create doubt, to reinforce my outsider status despite years of marriage. It was a familiar tactic, but one that had lost much of its power over time. "I'll examine all the pieces thoroughly next week," I said, choosing not to engage with the attempted provocation. "Including the ones with unverified locations. It's important to establish a complete baseline before undertaking any restoration work." "Of course," she agreed, too readily. "I look forward to your professional assessment." After hanging up, I immediately called Zoe again to update her on this latest development. "Wednesday gives us time to do more research," she noted. I'll see what I can find about any renovations to the Trust's storage facilities in 2018. If that was a legitimate project, there should be documentation, contracts, permits, that sort of thing. Good idea, I agreed. Meanwhile, I'm going to look more closely at item 37, the Patek Philippe that Vivian specifically highlighted. There's something about her sudden sentimental interest in this piece that doesn't ring true. Trust your instincts, Zoe advised. You knew Michael better than anyone. If Vivian's claims about his attachment to certain items don't align with what you know, that's significant. As I hung up, I found myself staring at the photograph of the Patek Philippe included in the documentation. It was undeniably a masterpiece of horological craftsmanship, its platinum case and applied Breguet numerals epitomizing the elegant restraint of high Art Deco design. What would Michael have thought about all this? The man I had loved had valued honesty and transparency above all else, often commenting that his mother's world of social positioning and appearance management exhausted him. He would have hated the manipulation and hidden agendas currently swirling around his family's legacy. With renewed determination, I began a systematic review of all the documentation Vivian had provided, looking for inconsistencies, gaps, or anything else that might reveal the true story behind her sudden interest in my professional expertise. Whatever game she and Hargrove were playing, I was determined to uncover it before committing to any arrangement that might compromise my independence or professional integrity. The truth was waiting somewhere in the intricate mechanical details of these historical treasures. Like the hidden components of a mystery clock, the real motivations were operating behind a facade of transparency, creating an illusion of straightforward movement while concealing the actual mechanisms at work. Wednesday arrived with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt since before Michael's death. The past week had been filled with intensive research and preparation, with Zoe and I working to uncover the true story behind Vivian's sudden interest in my expertise. Remember the plan? Zoe said as she dropped me off at the address Vivian had provided. A nondescript office building in an industrial area outside Portland's city center. Document everything. Take photos wherever permitted and don't sign. Anything, no matter how much pressure they apply. I've got this, I assured her, patting my messenger bag which contained a small notebook, my jeweler's loop, digital calipers, and a specialized camera for documenting timepiece mechanisms. Call you when I'm done. The building's lobby featured minimal signage, with only a directory indicating that the fourth floor housed Lockwood Family Holdings, Private Collection Management. The discretion made sense for a location storing valuable artifacts, but it also contributed to the general air of secrecy surrounding the entire operation. After checking in with security and confirming my appointment, I was escorted to the fourth floor, where Vivian waited in a small reception area, impeccably dressed as always in a tailored navy suit that conveyed authority and professionalism. Elena, she greeted me with a practiced smile. Thank you for coming. Daniel will be joining us shortly to discuss the restoration priorities. The mention of Hargrove's involvement wasn't a surprise, but his absence at the start of our meeting provided a valuable opportunity. While we're waiting, perhaps you could show me the storage facilities, I suggested. I'd like to get a sense of the environmental conditions the pieces have been kept in. It helps determine appropriate restoration approaches. Vivian hesitated momentarily before nodding. Of course, this way. She led me through a security door into a climate-controlled area that resembled a high-end bank vault more than a traditional storage space. Rows of metal cabinets lined the walls, each secured with electronic locks requiring both a keycard and numeric code for access. The collection is organized by category and acquisition date, Vivian explained, swiping her card at a terminal and entering a code. Timepieces are in Section C, cabinets 12 through 17. The cabinet slid open silently, revealing velvet-lined drawers containing carefully arranged watches and small clocks, each in its own protective case with identification, numbers corresponding to the inventory. Impressive security, I commented, genuinely impressed by the professional storage conditions. Has it always been maintained at this standard? Since the late 1990s, she confirmed. Before that, the collection was kept in various family properties, which created inconsistent conservation conditions. The centralization and climate control systems were implemented as part of the last major trust revision. I nodded, carefully opening one of the drawers to examine its contents. And the renovations in 2018 you mentioned? What did those involve? Vivian's expression remained neutral, but I detected a slight tightening around her eyes. Primarily upgrades to the security and monitoring systems. The collection had grown substantially over the previous decade, necessitating expanded storage capacity. I made a non-committal sound, focusing my attention on the timepieces before me. Each was exactly as described in the inventory, with condition, reports that appeared accurate based on my initial visual inspection. May I see cabinet 15? I asked casually. That should contain items 35 through 42, including the Patek Philippe you specifically mentioned. She complied, closing the first cabinet and opening another a few feet away. This one contained fewer pieces, each in larger, more elaborate protective cases befitting their greater value and complexity. The Patek Philippe, item number 37, was immediately identifiable, its platinum case and distinctive Art Deco styling unmistakable even behind the protective glass of its display case. May I? I asked, gesturing toward the case. Vivian nodded, though I noticed a subtle tension in her posture as I carefully removed the timepiece from its housing. Even to my trained eye, it was an extraordinary example of haute horlogerie from the period, the craftsmanship evident in every detail from the hand-finished movement to the applied numerals on the dial. Using my loupe, I examined the piece more closely, noting the condition issues consistent with the reports. Oxidation on several movement components, damage to the repeating mechanism, and slight deformation to one of the case lugs. Definitely restorable, I confirmed, though the repeating function will require specialized parts that may need to be custom fabricated. The original maker's records should still exist in the Patek archives, which would facilitate accurate restoration. Vivian seemed pleased with this assessment. Excellent. This piece is particularly important to the family, yes, you mentioned that. I completed her sentence, returning the watch to its case. Now, what about the pieces with unverified locations? Items 22, 43, and 51, if I recall correctly. The slight pause before her response confirmed my suspicions that this was a sensitive topic. Those would be in cabinet 16, she said, moving toward another storage unit. As I mentioned, they were temporarily relocated during the system upgrades. When she opened cabinet 16, I immediately noted something odd. The spacing of the protective cases seemed designed to disguise gaps where items should have been. 3 spaces were occupied by cases that, while similar to the others, appeared newer and less worn from handling. Before I could comment on this observation, the door to the storage area opened and Daniel Hargrove entered, his confident stride faltering slightly when he saw us already examining the collection. "Ah, Ms. Rivera," he greeted me with professional warmth. "I see you've already begun your assessment. My apologies for the delay. Traffic was unexpectedly heavy this morning." "No problem at all," I replied pleasantly. "Vivian has been showing me the storage facilities and we were just about to examine items 22, 43, and 51, the pieces that were relocated during renovations." A barely perceptible glance passed between Vivian and Hargrove, a fraction of a second of silent communication that confirmed they had expected to control which pieces I saw and in what order. "Perhaps we should discuss the restoration priorities. First," Hargrove suggested smoothly, "there's a conference room prepared with all the relevant documentation." "Actually, I'd prefer to complete my initial survey of the collection," I countered firmly. "Particularly these 3 pieces, since their condition reports are outdated. It's important to establish a complete baseline before discussing priorities. Backed into a corner, Vivian carefully removed one of the cases from cabinet 16 and placed it on the examination table. Item 22, Breguet desk chronometer, circa 1925. The moment she opened the case, my trained eye detected the discrepancy. While the timepiece was indeed a Breguet desk chronometer of the correct period, several subtle details didn't match the photographs in the inventory documentation. The placement of the subsidiary seconds dial was slightly different, and the signature on the movement, while authentic, was engraved with a different depth than shown in the historical records. "May I?" I asked, reaching for my camera. "The Trust has strict policies about photography," Hargrove interjected quickly, "for security reasons." I understood those restrictions applied to the facility itself, not to documenting the condition of pieces for restoration purposes, I replied, maintaining a professional tone while meeting his gaze directly. It would be virtually impossible to develop appropriate restoration protocols without detailed visual records. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. Of course, for restoration documentation only. I proceeded to take detailed photographs of the chronometer, being sure to capture the specific areas that diverged from the inventory records. I repeated this process with items 43 and 51 when they were presented, noting similar subtle discrepancies in each. "Very interesting pieces," I commented neutrally, completing my documentation. Now I'd be happy to discuss restoration priorities in the conference room. The remainder of the meeting proceeded with a carefully choreographed presentation of the proposed restoration project, with Hargrove outlining a multi-phase approach beginning with the Patek Philippe and several other high-value timepieces. Throughout the discussion, I maintained a facade of professional interest while mentally cataloging the inconsistencies I had observed. "Before we conclude," Vivian said as the meeting wound down, "I've prepared the trust recognition documents for your business, should you decide to proceed with the arrangement we discussed. Having reviewed the collection, I hope you'll agree this represents a significant opportunity." She slid a folder across the table containing legal papers with post-it notes marking signature lines. "I'll need to review these with my attorney," I replied, accepting the folder without opening it. "As I'm sure you understand, any formal arrangement would require proper legal scrutiny." A flicker of annoyance crossed Vivian's face, quickly masked by a professional smile. "Of course, though I should mention that the Trust Committee meets next week to finalize the restoration budget. Having your participation confirmed before then would be advantageous for all parties." The implied deadline was an obvious pressure tactic, one I had been expecting. "I'll expedite my review," I promised non-committally. "In the meantime, I'd like copies of today's condition assessments for my records." "My assistant will provide those before you leave," Hargrove assured me. "We're very much looking forward to working with you on this project, Ms. Rivera. Your reputation for meticulous restoration work is well-deserved, based on what I've seen of the Davies clock." The mention of the Davies clock, the piece that had been in my car when Vivian sold it, was clearly intended to remind me of how our paths had intersected, perhaps even to suggest a certain inevitability to our collaboration. It struck me as both calculated and slightly ominous. As the meeting concluded and I was escorted back to the lobby, I maintained a pleasant, professional demeanor while mentally reviewing everything I had observed. The substituted timepieces, the coordinated responses from Vivian and Hargrove, the pressure to sign documents quickly, all pointed to a scenario more complex and potentially problematic than I had initially suspected. Outside, I found Zoe waiting in her car as planned. "Well?" she asked as soon as I closed the passenger door. "They've replaced the missing items with similar pieces," I confirmed, opening my bag to show her the camera. "Convincing substitutes, but definitely not the originals. I've documented the discrepancies. And they want you to sign off on the trust recognition immediately?" I nodded, showing her the folder of documents. "Complete with artificial deadline pressure. The Trust Committee supposedly meets next week to finalize the restoration budget." Zoe pulled away from the curb, heading toward her office. This is bigger than we thought. They're not just covering up unauthorized sales, they're actively falsifying the collection inventory with substitute pieces. That goes beyond administrative irregularities into potential fraud. The question is why, I mused. The substitutes are valuable pieces in their own right, though worth perhaps a third of what the originals would command at auction. Why go to such lengths? Let's find out exactly what happened to the originals, Zoe suggested. I have a contact at Sotheby's who might be able to discreetly check if pieces matching those descriptions have appeared at auction in recent years. Back at Zoe's office, we meticulously compared my photographs with the inventory documentation, confirming the substitutions beyond any doubt. The 3 replacement pieces were authentic period timepieces of similar style to the originals, but with enough subtle differences to be definitively identified as different items. Zoe's contact at Sotheby's promised to conduct discreet inquiries, while I reached out to a former colleague now working at a respected auction house in Geneva, a major center for high-end watch auctions. With research underway, we turned our attention to the trust recognition documents Vivian had provided. This is interesting, Zoe said, frowning as she reviewed the paperwork. The language here goes well beyond what would be necessary to recognize your business as a legacy enterprise under the trust provisions. How so? I asked, peering over her shoulder at the legal text. This clause effectively makes you a co-signatory on all collection management decisions, including restoration approvals, deaccession authorizations, and acquisition protocols. She flipped to another flagged section. And this binds you to confidentiality regarding all aspects of the collection, with significant financial penalties for any disclosures. They're not just bringing me in as a restorer, I realized. They're making me complicit in whatever they've done with the original pieces. Exactly, Zoe confirmed grimly. Once you sign this, you'd be legally tied to their actions, past and present. If the substitutions were ever discovered, you'd share liability for the fraud. The scheme was clearer now. Use my legitimate restoration skills as cover for authenticating the substitute pieces, bind me legally to confidentiality, and create shared liability that would prevent me from ever exposing the fraud. What's our next move? I asked, the weight of the situation settling over me. We need more information before confronting them, Zoe advised. Specifically, we need to confirm what happened to the original pieces and who authorized their removal from the collection. 2 days later, we had our answers. Zoe's contact at Sotheby's confirmed that pieces matching the description of items 22 and 51 had been sold at private auctions in Geneva and Hong Kong, respectively, approximately 3 years ago. Both had been consigned through shell companies that ultimately traced back to a holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. More significantly, my Geneva contact provided bombshell information. The Breguet chronometer had been purchased by a prominent collector who subsequently had it authenticated by the manufacturer's archives department. During that process, it was discovered that the piece had been sold from a private American collection with documentation signed by both the V. Lockwood and D. Hargrove as authorized representatives. They didn't even attempt to hide their involvement in the private sale, I noted with surprise. Why risk using their real names? Because they assumed the paper trail would never be scrutinized, Zoe explained. Private sales at this level often involve confidentiality agreements. They probably never imagined we'd be able to trace the provenance back to them. Armed with this information, we now faced a critical decision: how to proceed with the knowledge that Vivian and Hargrove had conspired to sell valuable trust assets without proper authorization, replace them with less valuable substitutes, and attempt to legitimize the fraud by involving me in the scheme. We could take this information directly to the trust administrators, Zoe suggested. Or even to law enforcement, given the values involved. I considered this option, imagining the likely consequences: a legal battle that would become public, potentially damaging the Lockwood family name that Michael had valued despite his complicated relationship with his mother. There would be financial penalties, possibly even criminal charges against Vivian and Hargrove. There's another approach we could take, I said slowly, an alternative strategy forming in my mind. One that might achieve accountability without destroying everything in the process. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Vivian and Hargrove, suggesting my studio as a neutral location to discuss final details of the proposed arrangement. Both agreed readily, likely assuming I was prepared to sign the documents after consulting with Zoe. I arranged the space carefully, setting up 3 chairs around my primary workbench. On the surface between them, I placed the trust recognition documents, my restoration tools, and, most significantly, printed copies of the evidence we had gathered regarding the sold timepieces. Vivian arrived first, her expression shifting from confidence to wariness as she noted the arranged materials. "What's this?" she asked, gesturing toward the printouts. "Documentation we should discuss before finalizing any agreements," I replied, calmly. "Please, have a seat. Daniel should be here momentarily." When Hargrove arrived minutes later, the atmosphere in the studio had already grown tense. He glanced between Vivian and me, clearly sensing that something had changed since our previous meeting. "Thank you both for coming," I began once they were seated. "Before we proceed with any formal arrangements, I think we need to address some discrepancies I've discovered in the collection inventory." Without waiting for a response, I slid the first document across the table. A side-by-side comparison of the original Breguet chronometer from the inventory photographs and the substitute piece currently in the collection. Item 22 is not the original piece documented in the trust inventory, I stated flatly, nor are items 43 and 51. All 3 have been replaced with similar but less valuable substitutes. Vivian's face remained impressively impassive, though a slight tightening of her jaw betrayed her tension. Hargrove shifted in his seat but maintained his professional demeanor. "What's more interesting," I continued, presenting the next document, "is what happened to the original pieces. This is authentication documentation from Breguet's archives department, confirming that the original chronometer was sold at a private auction in Geneva 3 years ago. Note the signatures on the provenance verification." At this, both Vivian and Hargrove visibly stiffened, their eyes fixed on their own signatures on the document. "Similar documentation exists for the other pieces," I added, though I didn't. "Present it immediately." "All sold through shell companies that trace back to a Cayman Islands holding company, Lockwood International Holdings, I believe it's called." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Finally, Hargrove cleared his throat. "Ms. Rivera, these are complex trust management matters that involve selling valuable trust assets without proper authorization, replacing them with less valuable substitutes, and attempting to involve me in legitimizing the substitutions," I finished for him. "Yes, I'd say that's complex indeed. Fraudulently complex, one might argue." Vivian's composure finally cracked. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she snapped. "Those pieces were sold under completely legitimate circumstances with full trust authority." "Then you won't mind if I verify that with the other trustees," I countered smoothly. "I'm sure they'd be interested to know about the substitutions and the offshore accounts." Another tense silence fell. Hargrove and Vivian exchanged a glance that contained volumes of unspoken communication. "What do you want?" Vivian finally asked, her voice cold and calculating. It was the question I had been waiting for, the opportunity to present my alternative to legal action and public exposure. "3 things," I replied calmly. "First, the full value of the sold pieces will be returned to the trust through verifiable transfers from your personal accounts. No offshore funds, no shell companies, transparent restoration of the assets that should never have been removed." Hargrove started to object, but I continued before he could speak. "Second, You will withdraw all pressure regarding my business's recognition under the trust. If I choose to pursue that option, it will be on my timeline and with documentation that doesn't create shared liability for your past actions. I paused, letting these first two conditions sink in before delivering the third. Finally, the substituted pieces will be officially acquired by the trust at their actual market value, with proper documentation acknowledging them as replacements rather than originals. The collection's integrity will be maintained without perpetuating a fraud. Vivian's eyes narrowed. And if we refuse these conditions? Then the evidence goes to the trust administrators, the other family members involved in the trust, and if necessary, to law enforcement, I stated simply. I imagine the scandal would be significant, both personally and professionally. The threat hung in the air, its implications clear to everyone present. Vivian and Hargrove had committed what amounted to embezzlement from a family trust, using their positions of authority to personally profit from assets they were merely supposed to manage. Why not just expose us immediately? Hargrove asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. You clearly have sufficient evidence. The question surprised me with its directness. I considered my answer carefully, wanting to be honest about my motivations. Because destroying things is easy, I said finally. Restoration, whether of timepieces or relationships, is the more challenging and ultimately more valuable approach. Michael valued his family's legacy, complicated as it was. I believe he would want it preserved, but with integrity restored. At the mention of Michael, something shifted in Vivian's expression, a momentary softening that revealed the grief she normally kept hidden beneath her controlled exterior. He would have hated what I did, she admitted quietly, surprising both Hargrove and me with her candor. But the trust was underwater after the 2008 financial crisis. These pieces were the only liquid assets valuable enough to prevent complete collapse of the family holdings. The trustees wouldn't approve their sale officially. Too much sentiment attached to objects, not enough understanding of financial realities. It was the first genuine explanation she had offered, and despite everything, I found myself understanding her dilemma, if not her methods. That may explain the initial decision, I acknowledged, but not the substitutions or the attempt to involve me in covering up the actions. Pride, she said simply. The Lockwood collection has been considered complete and intact for generations. I couldn't be the one to officially diminish it, even if the action saved the broader family interests. Hargrove shifted uncomfortably. For my part, I advised legitimate private sales. The substitutions were... He hesitated. An additional service requested after the fact. I nodded, understanding the full picture now. A financial crisis, a proud matriarch unwilling to admit vulnerability, and a business associate willing to facilitate increasingly questionable solutions to maintain appearances. My conditions stand, I said firmly. Restore the financial value. To the trust, acknowledge the substitutions appropriately, and leave me and my business out of the deception. After a long moment of consideration, Vivian nodded once, decisively. Agreed. But I want something in return, beyond your silence. Which is? Your expertise, legitimate expertise, in restoring the Patek Philippe. Not as part of a cover-up, but because it truly was Michael's favorite piece from the collection. He admired it as a boy, and his father promised it would be his one day. Her voice softened almost imperceptibly. I'd like to honor that intention, belatedly. The request caught me off guard with its apparent sincerity. If the watch truly had been special to Michael, restoring it properly would be a fitting tribute to his memory. I'll restore the watch, I agreed, not as part of any trust arrangement, but as an independent commission. My standard professional terms, with no special conditions or confidentiality clauses. Relief flickered across Vivian's features before her composed mask returned. Acceptable, I'll have the financial transfers initiated today and the documentation for the substitute pieces revised as you've outlined. As they prepared to leave, Vivian paused by the door. Elena, she said, using my first name with unusual directness. Michael chose better than I was willing to admit. Your integrity would have made him proud. The acknowledgement, perhaps the first genuine respect she had ever shown me, struck deeper than expected. Not because I needed her approval, but because it represented a small bridge across the chasm that had separated us since Michael's death. Restoration isn't just about returning something to its original state, I replied, glancing meaningfully at my workbench covered with the tools of my trade. Sometimes it's about acknowledging damage and creating something honest from what remains. The beauty is in the resilience, not the pretense of perfection. She nodded once, understanding the metaphor extended beyond timepieces to our own complicated relationship. Then she was gone, leaving me alone in my studio with the tools of restoration and the promise of a new beginning built on hard-won truth rather than convenient fictions. In the weeks that followed, Vivian honored our agreement completely. The financial value of the sold pieces was returned to the trust through documented transfers. The substitute pieces were properly acquired with transparent documentation, and the pressure regarding my business's trust recognition evaporated entirely. I began work on restoring the Patek Philippe, approaching the project with the same meticulous care I brought to all my commissions. As I disassembled the complex mechanism, carefully cleaning each component and addressing the damage accumulated over decades, I found myself reflecting on the parallel process occurring in my relationship with Vivian, a relationship also damaged by time and circumstance, but perhaps not beyond repair. 3 months later, with the restoration complete, I invited Vivian to my studio for the ceremonial first winding of the restored timepiece. As the minute repeating function chimed clearly for the first time in decades, marking the hours, quarters, and minutes with crystalline precision, I saw genuine emotion in her typically controlled expression. He would have loved hearing that sound again, she said softly, touching the platinum case with reverent fingers. Tell me about him as a boy, I invited, opening a door to conversation we had never before been able to share. What drew him to this particular piece? As Vivian began sharing stories of Michael's childhood fascination with mechanical objects, I realized we had achieved something more valuable than any timepiece, regardless of its rarity or market value. We had begun the delicate process of restoring a human connection, acknowledging past damage without allowing it to determine future possibilities. Like the mystery clocks I so often restored, with their illusion of hands floating in midair, the most beautiful mechanisms are often the ones whose inner workings remain invisible to casual observation. The complex reconciliation beginning between Vivian and me would never be fully visible to outsiders, but its operation would change the trajectory of both our lives in ways neither of us could have anticipated when she sold my car with its hidden treasure inside. The true value had never been in the physical objects at all, but in the human connections they helped forge, break, and ultimately restore, stronger at the mended places, like the finest examples of the restorer's art. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.